In this video, I'm going to essentially go over every single concept that Dr. P hits. And then after I go over the concepts, I'll go over exactly how she tests and what you have to know for each test. With like case studies and how to read EKGs perfectly, because the multiple choice questions, everything that I'm going over on my study guide and that I will teach you is essentially common sense. I don't want to, there's no other way to say it. I mean, it's really not that hard. So the multiple choice isn't really what makes a test hard. It's only 30 multiple choice. Multiple choice is very, very simple. Always eliminate answers. The hard part is going to be case studies, short answers, and reading EKG. Reading the EKG is actually the hardest part. So you have to be able to read an EKG perfect. Okay, so again, I'm sorry that the test is tomorrow and I'm making this video today, so I'm gonna probably finish this video in about 90 minutes and it's gonna take an hour to upload because YouTube sucks, so you probably won't get this till probably 11 or so. So again, I'm sorry, I've been very busy. Making videos not my first priority. Okay, so just go over the study guide, basically what you need to know for the multiple choice questions, and then I'll go into detail exactly what you need to know for case studies and exactly how she's going to answer and what you need to know. And not just giving you answers saying this is what it is based on past tests. She chooses these questions. Although it is true she does recycle a lot of her questions, I'm not going to say exactly what questions she's going to ask because that will be cheating. Okay, so the first question is know the modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors for cardiovascular disease and how does exercise improve these? Well, by this point in this major, you should probably know that exercise is good and it improves everything in the body. That's what our major is, exercise physiology, exercise science, using exercise to reverse chronic diseases, mainly being cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, heart, all that good stuff. So exercise fixes all these things. So yeah, exercise improves everything. So you need to know all the non-modifiable and modifiable risk factors. Those are the most important things. If you get nothing out of this class, know these 8 risk factors. They're relevant in any health field you ever enter. You're gonna have to know these risk factors. Whether you're a PT, an MD, an RN, whatever the hell you do, you're gonna need to know these risk factors. Okay, so there's 8 modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors, and they're for heart disease. Or you can see heart disease written as cardiovascular disease, CVD, or coronary artery disease, CAD. Now, to some extent, these are interchangeable. Coronary artery disease is a specific type of cardiovascular disease, but they're used interchangeably. So in this case, just they're the same thing. Don't get confused by using CVD or CAD. Okay, so the modifiable risk factor, the non-modifiable ones are, these are 2 risk factors that you cannot change, thus the name non-modifiable. So now what you do, you cannot change these risk factors. You're stuck with these. There's nothing you can do about it. The first one's age. I guess she changed it now, or she didn't change it, but the ACSM guidelines changed it to where is if you're 45 or older, if you're a man, so if you're 45 or older, that's considered a risk factor. Of course, obviously you can't do anything about age, so everyone in this class or everyone in this university pretty much doesn't have a risk factor for age, unless they're over 45. Or the 45 or older. So all of us are free of that risk factor. We don't have to worry about it. That's one risk factor. 45 or older for men. Now for women, it's 55 or older. Again, these are just numbers you have to memorize, cutoffs. So if you're under these ages, you don't have to worry about this risk factor. But the reason it is greater for women is because they have something called a menstrual cycle with estrogen. And for some reason, estrogen is protective against heart disease. We don't know the exact reason, but estrogen's good, so we'll go with that. So that's why women have a higher risk factor at 55. So that's family history, not families, that's age. 45 or older for men, 55 or older for women. Know those cutoffs, you'll need to know them. Second one is family history. If you are a man and someone in your family has had a heart condition, it has to be a heart condition, it can't be a metabolic disease or asthma or anything, but if someone in your family has had a heart condition and it's a first degree relative, so if it's your father or brother, it can't be your second brother or your uncle, it has to be your father or brother. If your father or brother has had a heart condition before age 55, that's considered a risk factor. If you're women, it's the same thing, your mother or your daughter or sister has had a heart condition before age 65, it's a risk factor. Beyond 65, 55 and 65 for men and women, and if they have a heart condition beyond those ages, it doesn't count as a risk factor because it could be just a disease of aging. It could be a problem just aging. But if you have it before 55 for men, if it's your father or your brother, that's not your son. If it's your father or brother, if you're a man before age 55, it's considered a risk factor. If it's your mother or daughter before daughter, why do I keep saying daughter? Mother or sister before age 65, it's a risk factor. So those are non-modifiable. You can't do anything about them. If heart disease runs in your family, that's unfortunately a risk factor. But it's only one risk factor, and as you find out, there's 6 modifiable risk factors that you can easily change by having a healthy lifestyle. So one risk factor is lipid levels. It's called dyslipidemia. We'll go over more detail of that on questions. I don't know what question is, but we'll go over more detail on it. So dyslipidemia, that's cholesterol, LDL, or HDL. There's certain values you have to know, and if you either go higher than these values or lower than these values, it's a risk factor. So age, family history, dyslipidemia, that's 3. Physical activity, if the cutoff is you have to be physically active 3 times a day for 30 minutes for at least 3 months. It's in order to not have that risk factor. Smoking, if you've been around smoke or if you smoke within the last 6 months, it's a risk factor. We all know smoking's bad. Don't smoke. It's a risk factor for cardiovascular disease and pretty much every single disease known to man. So that's 5. Second one is obesity. 6th one's obesity. Definition of obesity is having a BMI of 30 or above. So you can have a BMI of 30 and still be considered obese. 30 or above, we'll go over how to calculate BMI later. That's considered a risk factor. Hypertension, 140 over 90, systolic, diastolic. You know this, if not, or it doesn't matter anyway, we'll be going over it. And the last one is impaired fasting glucose, or impaired fasting glucose, IFG. She'll usually write it as FG, or fasting glucose. If your fasting glucose is over 100, you are considered pre-diabetic. It's considered a risk factor. Again, I'll go over more detail of that later, since this is just a rough thing. So modifiable risk factor, all the risk factors. How does exercise improve these? These are common sense. Obviously, exercise makes you lose weight. It lowers your blood pressure. Well, not really too much lowers your blood pressure, but it raises your HDL, makes you healthier. We all know this. Exercise improves every single risk factor. Of course, minus age and family history, you can't do anything about them. Exercise is good. You should know that. So exercise improves every risk factor. That's the point of this class. How else can individuals modify the risk factors? They can do a lot of things. Obviously, you can stop smoking, you can exercise, you can lose weights, you can stop eating fatty foods and being a lazy ass and not have diabetes. There's a lot of things you can do to prevent these risk factors. That's why there's 6 modifiable risk factors and 2 modifiable. Yet, cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer in the United States. So, obviously, the average American is lazy and they should just change their lifestyle and we can fix a lot of health problems. That's what this class is about. Question 2 is what are the sources of injury that can happen to the endothelium of the artery and what is nitric oxide? I don't know how in detail she went with nitric oxide, but in my class she didn't really go that much detail into it, but she asked one question on it. The endothelium of the artery, source of injury that can happen to the endothelium of the artery. That is the beginning stages of atherosclerosis when, or pretty much every cardiovascular disease, coronary artery disease, when you damage your arteries start building a bunch of stuff, a bunch of macrophages, lymphocytes, bunch of cholesterol gets on it, LDL, all that stuff, and you start building plaque. You don't know specifically what the course of it is, but you start building plaque, essentially. That's what happens when you damage your endothelium of the artery, a bunch of cholesterol attaches to it, you build a bunch of plaque in your coronary arteries that supply blood flow to your heart. This is what coronary artery disease is. You build plaque, you occlude the blood flow to your heart, you get a myocardial infarction or heart disease. That's usually how that's the pathophysiology of usually every single chronic condition of heart disease. You have a bad diet, you have a bad lifestyle, you build plaque in your coronary arteries, and thus they get a heart attack because you occlude blood flow to the heart. So sources of injury that can happen, well, smoking is the biggest source of injury. Again, smoking's bad, it can do everything. Smoking, high cholesterol, not a lot of physical activity, you can be overweight. A lot of things can lead to this process. Now, an interesting thing that you probably didn't go over, or they don't usually go over, but an interesting fact that I want to share is, regardless of what you do in life, if you live a perfect life, your arteries are going to be damaged. Your endothelium of the arteries are going to be damaged. It's a process of living. That's why perfectly healthy people that are like 25, 30, they get heart attacks and they have no risk factors for heart disease. It's just a fact of life. It's going to happen. But it can be accelerated by certain acts, by like smoking, being diabetic, having definitely high blood pressure, can be accelerated by a lot of things. And what nitric oxide is called a vasodilator. It causes your arteries to vasodilate or expand. So this is a substance that your body naturally makes. And one thing is when you're exercising, say your body releases nitric oxide in order to vasodilate so you can get more blood flow to your muscles. It's something that happens naturally. So that's what nitric oxide is. It's just created naturally in order to vasodilate your arteries and get more blood flow to a certain muscle. And this is what nitroglycerin tablets for myocardial infarction, for heart attack patients are. Nitroglycerin tablets contain nitric oxide. So going off topic again, nitric oxide. So if you hear about nitric oxide supplementation for athletes, that's stupid because you make nitric oxide in your body, so it doesn't do anything for weightlifting or anything. There's no benefit to taking nitric oxide unless you have coronary artery disease. It's stupid. It's pointless. Your body makes nitric oxide. So that's just a little side thing. Question 3, that's the only real big memorization in this class. You just have to memorize all these numbers. Cholesterol, you have to memorize, you want less than 200. Again, everyone probably knows that because it's so relevant nowadays. But you want less than 200 for cholesterol. Your HDL is considered your high density lipoproteins. It's the good cholesterol. So you want this above 40. 40 is the cutoff, so you want it above 40. And now the only way to raise HDL is with physical activity. More importantly, aerobic activity. So sprinting doesn't really raise it too well, but aerobic activity is the only thing that raises HDL. So you want a high HDL. That's the only really value of all these things that you want high of. Now LDL is the bad cholesterol. LDL, you don't want a lot of LDL. If it's above 130, that's a risk factor, which we'll go over. But in order to confuse you even more, you want below 100. Below 100 is considered ideal. Above 130 is a risk factor. It's very confusing. And that, of course, that's a question that I missed. But again, know these ranges. The ranges are in the book. If you don't have the book, Google them. It's not that hard to Google ideal LDL ranges. Triglycerides, you want less than 150. That might be a multiple choice question. You want less than 150. Triglycerides, fat, fancy name for fat, you want less than 150. Hematocrits, all these questions could just be easy multiple choice because hematocrit would never be in a case study. Hematocrit is the percentage of red blood cells. Hematocrit is a fancy word for red blood cells. And whatever this percentage is, this is how much red blood cells you actually have in a certain surface area of blood. The ideal percent for men is 40 to 52%. If you have less than 40% hematocrit, that's pretty bad. That means you have a very low count of red blood cells. Above 52%, that could be bad, but actually that is bad if you have above 52% because a fun fact that I include here is if you have a red blood cell count above 52% or even closer, well 52 is the cutoff, it's real iffy what the cutoff is, but if you have a red blood cell above 52% hematocrit, you're actually banned from sporting events. This is the percentage, this is one of the blood markers that they measure for athletic events. Like for cycling, this is what they measure your hematocrit level, among many other things. And for athletic events like running and the Olympics, they measure your hematocrit. Because if your blood cells are okay, it's a little better. If your red blood cell is above 52%, well, there's no way to really get that high naturally. So you must be either blood doping, well, probably all blood doping, or taking EPO, erythropoietin, or you're doing something illegally to get your red blood cells that high. So if it's above 52%, you're banned from the Olympics. Again, that's not important. You're not going to ask that, but that's a range. That's an easy way to help memorize it. If it's above 52%, you can relate it to real life. For women, it's lower, 36 to 48%. You're not going to know the exact ranges. She's not going to ask like 36 to 48%, B, 37 to 52 to 49%. Which one is it? She's not going to ask questions like that. It'll be very vastly different percentages if she does ask questions about hematocrit. But for women, it's lower because women are smaller. They have less blood. They have less body mass, so they don't need as many red blood cells. Your BMI, we'll go over more BMI, but that is a rough indicator of how you stack up with everyone in your population and your age group. That is kilograms minus meters squared. We'll go over more of that. Hemoglobin is kind of like hematocrit. It's a number, but this is, well, it's a number. Of course, it's a certain number of how much hemoglobin you have per deciliter of blood. For men, the ideal range is 13.5 to 17. For women, it's lower because, again, they have smaller bodies. They don't have as much blood. The muscles aren't as large. So it's 11.5 to 15.5. Again, for men, if the hemoglobin is below the cutoff, they're considered anemic. If it's above it, then again, the blood doping, you can't get that much hemoglobin naturally. HbA1c, I'll go in more detail because this is the only point where this is covered. HbA1c is a blood marker for diabetes. HbA1c is a protein on your red blood cells. So it's a known protein that's on the surface of your red blood cells, and this is a sugar protein. Sugar binds to this protein. In what this percentage is, 5.7 to 6.4%, that's what you need to be considered pre-diabetic. If it's less than that, that's good. If it's higher than 6.4, you're diabetic. Well, it's iffy to say you're diabetic because you have to do more tests, but that's a big indicator. Now, what this number is this is how much surface area of that HbA1c protein is covered in sugar. Obviously, if less than 5.7% is covered in sugar, then you're not really in danger of being pre-diabetic. You're clearing your bloodstream. It's not picking up the sugar. If more than 6.4% is covered in sugar, you're definitely diabetic. That's considered the cutoff range. More than 6.4%, less than 5.7%. In between that range of 5.7 to 6.4, you're pre-diabetic. That might be a question. I'm saying that because that was a question from my class. I don't know if she's going to repeat the same exact questions. Actually, it was a question on every single exam. She likes to repeat questions on exams. So if you do bad on the first exam, you're probably going to do bad on the other exams unless you study more. Okay. Blood pressure lower than 120/80. You probably know this at this point. We'll go more about that. Waist circumference. She might have changed it because I've heard that she didn't change it again. The ACSM guidelines changes the cutoffs. It's greater or, it's equal to or greater than 40 inches for men. It's considered a risk factor, and for women, it's greater or, it's equal or greater than 35. Again, don't quote me on the exact numbers because it's been like 2 years before I took this, since I took this class. So I'm pretty sure the guidelines have changed since then because America is not getting better with cardiovascular disease. They might change the guidelines. Question 4, what are the blood tests to assess liver and kidney function? This is a simple multiple choice question. There's no other way she could ask this in a case study, just simple multiple choice. The easiest blood test to test your liver and kidney. Now you can memorize a blood test or you can think of what they do. The kidneys, the point of the kidneys is for excretion. It's for filtration of any fluids out of your body. Urine, pretty much anything out of your body goes either through your large intestine, you excrete it, or goes out through your kidney. So kidney is for excretion. Liver is for pretty much a lot of everything. So if you think about what these do, it's very easy to know what the blood markers are, what the tests are. So if the liver is mostly for excretion and anything that's pretty much all the waste products in the body go to the liver, not the liver, to the kidney, let's say. Forget the large intestine. All the waste products, pretty much all waste products, urea, ammonia, all creatine, all that stuff, urine obviously, water, all that stuff goes out through the kidney. So obviously the best test for the kidney is to look at the composition of the urine. All certain molecules in the urine that should not be there. If like glucose, which should normally not be in the urine, it's normally filtered out and returned to the body because glucose is very important. If it's in the urine, then there must be a problem. For some reason, you have too much glucose in your bloodstream, so maybe you're diabetic. Or maybe your body is not filtering the glucose. If you have proteins in your urine, obviously you don't want to pee out proteins. So your body, for some reason, is not filtering out proteins, and something is wrong with your kidneys. You're going into kidney failure or something. Now, but the exact test you have to memorize, unfortunately, but that's a concept. It's easy to memorize. Exact tests are a creatinine test or a blood urea test. Urea is a breakdown of protein. If you have a lot of urea in your urine, that must mean your diet is high in protein. If you have too much urea in your urine, then you should probably do something. You don't want to build up of urea. Creatinine is the same thing. You urinate out creatinine. If you have too much, again, these are all just tests to assess something wrong with the body. So blood urea and creatinine. Now for the liver, you have a bilirubin test, and this is a protein that's in jaundice. It's a yellow protein, and normally this protein does not do anything in the body. But if you can't break it down for some reason, if it's present in your liver, then something's wrong with your liver because it's not breaking it down. So you can see all these tests just look to see if something is wrong. If a molecule that is normally there, as normally should not be there, is there. So you got a bilirubin test, SGOT, SGPT. Should not go over those at all. Just again memorize those words. So again, you guys gotta memorize those words. So for kidney test, you have a blood urea test and the creatinine test, and for liver, you have bilirubin test, SGOT, SGPT. You don't have to know what those are, just memorize them. That will probably be a question, most likely. Question 5, very simple. What is a PAR-Q test? PAR-Q test is a bunch of questions that the client has to answer. Before you do any, when you're a health profession or an exercise testing profession or medical or whatever the hell you are, or you're a personal trainer, before you touch a client at all, before you have them do anything, they have to do a few things. They have to sign a PAR-Q test. They have to do an informed consent and a medical history. Because if they do not do these things, they don't do an informed consent and they hurt themselves, they can sue you because they were never bind in contract. They never agreed to anything. If you don't do a PAR-Q test, you have no idea what their history is, or if they can handle certain things. If they don't do medical history, you don't know what the hell the medical history is. So these are all legal things. PAR-Q test is just a bunch of questions like, are you capable of handling this exercise? Have you ever passed out? Have you ever blah, 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 done this? Just a simple, basic questions. So very simple. Points of medical history and informed consent. Obviously, medical history is anything medical that ever happened to a patient. Any surgeries, they had asthma, they were not really flu, but asthma, they had cancer, they had surgery, they were in the hospital for this, they had this disease, everything. Everything that a health professional would or an exercise professional would have to know before they work with a patient. If you're a personal trainer patient, or if you're a physical personal trainer and you're training someone in the gym and exercise, what do you want to know about them? You probably want to know if they have had a heart attack before. You probably want to know if they have high blood pressure. You probably want to know these contraindications to exercise that can possibly be bad, and you can aggregate them and it can screw you over because you got them sicker after exercising. Informed consent is just what the word says. You're getting their consent. It tells them all the benefits of exercise of this program that they're going through, whether it's a VO2 test, a personal training test, metabolic test, BMR test, whatever it is. It's telling them the benefits and telling them the possible cons in the worst case scenario. Worst case scenario. So the patient knows exactly what they gain themselves into. And then of course they have to sign it. Nothing is legal unless they sign it. This whole point is just getting their signature so they know the possible bad effects of what can happen. And I'm sure everyone's signed an informed consent before. Everyone in this class has probably ran a 5K at some point in their life. You exercise science majors, I'm sure you exercise. When you do a 5K or a 10K or any race, you always sign an informed consent. That's what the little signature is, and all this, the words in small print. That's an informed consent. Okay. Question 7, what are the risk factors for cardiovascular disease? What are signs and symptoms? What is the risk stratification? This is probably the most important question for this class and for it being in this major. You have to know all 8 risk factors, and you have to be able to, because just knowing them is not good enough, because Dr. P is a real professor, and she actually has to test ways that students will learn by making them written tests, short answers, being case studies. You're going to do an oral test in the lab where you're actually going to have to answer these things face to face with her, so you have to know exactly what you're doing. So again, those 8 risk factors. The 2 non-modifiable risk factors that you can't do anything about are age and family history. If you're a man and you're 45 or older, you're automatically at risk for heart disease. It's just a fact that as the heart's a muscle, just like any muscle, as you get older, it gets weaker. Of course, you can obviously slow this process down, but it's just a fact of life. As your body grows, you get weaker. As your heart gets older, it gets weaker. It's a fact of life. So men above 45 equal to 45 or older, risk factor. Women 55 or older, risk factor. Women have estrogen, so they're stronger than men. Actually, their hearts are stronger than men up to a certain point, or they're protective. That's one risk factor. One non-modifiable risk factor. Family history is another one. If you are a man and your father or your brother has had a heart condition or heart surgery or a heart attack, at 55 or younger, that's a risk factor. If you're a woman, it's 65 or younger, and it has to be your mom or your sister. Your mom or your sister. Again, 55 or younger. If it's older than that cutoff, it's not considered a risk factor simply because maybe they had the heart disease because of age or some factor beyond whatever. It just has to be below that cutoff. So those are the two non-modifiable. Now we get to the modifiable ones, the ones you can do something about. Okay, so smoking. If you've been smoking in the past 6 months, that's a risk factor automatically. Stop smoking. Or if you're simply around smoke. She will be tricky, and there will be a case study where it says they do not smoke, but their brother smokes and they're in the house. That's a risk factor. It's modifiable because obviously you can do something if you're around smoke. It's called leave the house, leave that situation. So that is considered a risk factor, just as long as they're around smoke. So if the case study says they don't smoke, but in their job people smoke a lot, or they're in an environment with a lot of smoke, risk factor. So that can be one of the trick questions because she loves asking trick questions. We have to understand it perfectly. So smoking, it has to be within 6 months. If it says they quit smoking 5 months ago, still a risk factor. And again, I'm saying all these things because she will ask them. I've seen them in many case studies. Physical activity, the criteria is you have to be exercising for at least 3 days a week for 30 minutes for at least 3 months. Physically inactive, risk factor. That's 4. Diabetes, no, diabetes last. Obesity, BMI of 30 or above. Now she won't give you the BMI right out. It's not that simple. She's going to give you the height and she's going to give you the weight. And you're going to have to be able to calculate BMI. So if you don't have a calculator, get one. If you don't know how to calculate BMI, learn how to calculate BMI. It's very simple. You convert the weight, whatever it is. So say I'm 150, I believe. Don't know, but I haven't. Say I'm 150. You will convert that to kilograms first. Look at the units. It's kilograms divided by meters squared. So convert your 150 to kilograms by dividing by 2.2. Dividing by 2.2. Memorize that conversion factor. Divide by 2.2. Kilograms are less than pounds. So 150 divided by 2.2 is 70. So I'm 70 kilograms. So you have your kilograms. Now you have to get meters per second. So take my height, 5'10", convert that to inches. So just do 12 times 5, 60 plus 10 inches, 70. So I'm 70 inches. Now there's no way to convert inches to meter. Well, actually there is, but she always goes over the other way. So to convert inches to centimeters. First you have to convert inches to, I just said it, inches to centimeters. You do that by multiplying by 2.54. There should be more centimeters in inches. That's common sense, but I'm saying this because a lot of people have done, they solve these things without thinking. So they just plug in numbers and they get a crazy answer. They convert 70 inches and they divide by 2.2 instead of multiplying by 2.2 because it's a simple calculator mistake. So they're not thinking and they continue through it. So obviously you should have more centimeters and inches. So 70 inches times 2.54 equals 177 inches, 177 centimeters. Convert centimeters to meters by dividing by 100. So obviously meters should be very small compared to your actual height. So I am 1.7 meters. No one is probably taller than 2 meters. This is a way to check yourself. If your answer is like 7 meters, you've done something wrong. No one is that tall. So 1.7 meters, then you have to square it. So 1.7 meters squared is like 3.4. Then you divide by 70 divided by 3.4. I am like 22 kilograms per meter squared. So my BMI is 22. 22 is considered a normal BMI. Again, Okay, I guess you do have to know the cutoffs. The cutoffs for BMI are, shit, I forgot it. 18.5 to 24.9, I believe. Again, I might be wrong with the cutoffs because it's been a while since I've even looked at BMI because I don't like BMI. It's not that efficient. So if I'm not right about the cutoffs, don't get on me and say, oh, you don't know anything. But it's like 18.5 to 24.9 is considered under. Just kidding. 18.5. Okay, I don't even know the cutoffs anymore. Learn the cutoffs yourself. I'm sorry. If it's above 30 to, if it's above 30 or higher, I mean, if it's 30 or higher, you're considered obese. That's really the only thing you care about. But you're going to have to be able to classify the risk factors as being someone being obese, overweight. Okay, I remember some of the cutoffs. 24.9, I mean 25 to 29.9 is considered overweight. 30 to 34.9 is considered obese or obese 1, whatever you want to call it. 35 higher is considered obese 2. You're going to have to know those cutoffs. Now, I don't know the cutoffs, unfortunately, for underweight. Well, actually, I'm just kidding. Underweight is below 18.5. So I just taught myself. I learned all the the ranges again. So I learned something. But if your BMI is above 30 or higher, you're considered obese. That's a risk factor. So we have age, family history, smoking, physical activity, obesity. The other risk factor is hypertension. If your blood pressure is 170 over 90, 170, 140 over 90, you're considered hypertensive. Now, she's going to get tricky, and what you have to know is 140 over 90, so systolic over diastolic. Now, it can either be 140 or 90. So if the patient is 150 over 70, they're still considered hypertensive because they meet the 140 criteria. If their blood pressure is 130 over 95, they're still considered hypertensive because they meet the diastolic criteria. They just have to meet one or the other. They don't have to meet both of them. I don't think you're going to have to know the different, like, hypertensive class 1, class 2. You just have to know 140 over 90, I believe. So 140 over 90 is one of the risk factors. So I believe that's 6 risk factors. Now, yeah, 6 risk factors. The other one is dyslipidemia. This is any abnormal count of your lipids. You have cholesterol, LDL, and HDL. If your cholesterol is above 200, that's a risk factor. If your LDL is above 130, that's a risk factor. If your HDL is below, remember HDL is good cholesterol, below 40, that's a risk factor. Now it's one or the other. If they have high cholesterol, if they have like a cholesterol 210 and LDL of 150, that's not 2 risk factors, that's only 1. All of these qualify for dyslipidemia. You just need one of the criterias. So above 200 for cholesterol, LDL above 130, or HDL below 40. Now, something that she also goes over that's never really a problem because she usually gives cholesterol, you can't add LDL and HDL to get your total cholesterol. The body is much more complicated than that. Just go with the numbers. So it's either cholesterol, LDL, or HDL. Don't get HDL confused with LDL. I'm saying that because I made that mistake on a test. I was going very fast, and I confused LDL with HDL. Stupid mistake, but I did it. And then you look back on the test and you're like, God damn it, I'm a fucking idiot. But don't confuse HDL and LDL. Very easy mistake to make. So if your HDL is below 40 and your LDL is above 130, that's a risk factor. Now, one thing is if since HDL is so good for your body, if it's above 60, that's considered a negative risk factor, and you can take off one of these positive risk factors, which we'll go over at the end. Now, your last one is impaired fasting glucose. If your IFG, your impaired fasting glucose, is between 100 and 126, I believe is a cutoff. Again, I'm wary about the exact cutoffs because it's been a while since I took this class. Just you should know the exact cutoffs, Google them. But if it's below that range, you're considered pre-diabetic, that's a risk factor. And what this number is this impaired fasting glucose is your fasting. So say you fast for 8 hours. Everyone has glucose in the bloodstream. Our body lives on glucose. That's where our cells live on. It's fuel for our cells. So after we're fasting for 8 hours or we're sleeping, whatever, obviously we have not eaten in a while, we get glucose from our food, also from other sources. But if we haven't eaten in a while, our blood sugar starts to go very, very low and plummet. That's what makes us hungry. We have very low blood sugar. So I'm sure everyone has been hypoglycemic, had low blood sugar because you've been very hungry. But if you have But if you've been fasting and your blood sugar is below 100, that's normal. That's just how it should be. Now, if you're fasting and your blood sugar is above 100, 100 to 126 specifically, then there's some problem with metabolizing blood sugar. Maybe your body does not react to insulin, which is the hormone that's needed to metabolize that blood sugar, to bring the blood sugar into the cell, or maybe your body does not make insulin, so you can't bring the blood sugar into the cell. Either way, you have high blood sugar, between 100 and 126. If you're pre-diabetic. If it's below those ranges, between those ranges, and your body has some problem metabolizing glucose, blood sugar, you're considered pre-diabetic. Now, if it's above 126, again, I don't know the exact cutoff, you're considered diabetic, and that we'll talk about that different. That makes you high risk automatically, regardless of your risk factors. Reason being having high blood sugar is very, 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 very bad for your heart because it leads to many other problems that we won't go over. Okay, so these are the risk factors: age, family history, non-modifiable, smoking, physical activity, hypertension, separate than that, hypertension, obesity, dyslipidemia, and impaired fasting glucose. 8 risk factors. Every single case study goes through all 8 of these risk factors. Just read through the case study and pick out every single risk factor and add them up. And then, depending what this number is, it depends if they're low risk, medium risk, or low risk or medium risk. If it's 1 or below, I believe, it's 1 or less risk factors, they're considered very low risk. So you add up all those risk factors. If they have 1 or 0, you also have -1, which we'll go over, but if it's 1 or 0, they're considered low risk. If it's 2 or higher, they're considered medium risk. So they can have all 8 risk factors, and they're considered medium risk still. Now, the reason they can have a negative risk factor is because you add up all these risk factors. Now, if their HDL is above 60, you take off one of those risk factors. So say they had 7 risk factors. Now, they have really high HDL, which is very, I doubt it if they have 7 risk factors, but if they have 7 risk factors, they have very high HDL, you take off a risk factor, and they have 6 risk factors. If they already had 2 risk factors, when they have very high HDL, now they have 1 risk factor, so that makes them low risk. And now, in order to be considered high risk is irrelevant of the risk factors. You can have all 8 risk factors and still be considered medium risk. High risk means they have a symptom of heart disease, or they've had a heart attack in the past, or I think that's all the only thing that means high risk. Yeah, it has nothing to do with family history. So they have any of the symptoms of cardiovascular disease, which we'll go over, or they've had a heart disease in the past, or they have diabetes, or they have asthma. Those are the 3 situations. I've had case studies which said this patient has asthma, blah, 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 and lists a bunch of risk factors. Well, they're already high risk. You don't have to read the risk factors, but I would anyways because it's always better to put more information than you need to know. But they're high risk because they have asthma, or if they've had a previous MI but they have no risk factors, they're still high risk because they had a previous MI. If they're diabetic, well, she's not going to go out and say they're diabetic. She's going to say they're impaired fasting glucose or glucose tolerance test. Well, glucose tolerance test is another thing, but she's going to say their fasting glucose is like 150. Well, you should know, that's above 126. They're diabetic, they're high risk. In the oral glucose tolerance test, which IGT, I guess, is one of the abbreviations I saw, but the test is OGTT, oral glucose tolerance test. This is another test for impaired fasting glucose, which is someone goes to a hospital, they give them a very, very sugary drink, which spikes their glucose, the blood sugar, up to, say, like 200. So they're they have a lot of sugar in their system. So, and then over the course of like 4 hours, well, normally over the course, your blood sugar is going to decrease as your body makes more insulin, you start metabolizing that glucose, your blood sugar will decrease. Well, for someone that's diabetic or pre-diabetic, their blood sugar will decrease very, very, very slow. And the ranges between 140 and 199. Again, it's just another range you have to memorize. You can use that range. But 140 to 199 is they're considered pre-diabetic. Above 199, they're considered diabetic. That's just another range you have to know. But if they have any of these risk factors, they're considered high risk. Now, the risk factors for cardiovascular disease are tachycardia, which is a fancy word for having a heart rate above 100 beats per minute at rest. So, like, if you're exercising, obviously your heart rate is going to be higher than 100 beats per minute. That's not a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. But if me right now just talking or sleeping, my heart rate was above 100, that's bad. It should not be that high. That's a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So tachycardia, sleep apnea. This means sleep apnea actually means you stop breathing during sleep, which is usually caused to obesity and being overweight. Stop. So sleep apnea is clearly bad. Ankylodemia. Ankylodemia is one of the biggest signs for heart failure. Again, won't go into pathophysiology or why, but if your ankles are swelling, that's a big sign for heart failure. You're retaining water, that's not good. So ankylodemia, instantly high risk. Something is up in the body, it should not be that way. So you have tachycardia, sleep apnea, or orthopnea. Orthopnea is a fancy word, another word for sleep apnea. They mean the same thing. Orthopnea specifically means discomfort while sleeping or sitting up. Same thing as sleep apnea, really. Ankylodemia, dyspnea means you get short. Dyspnea is the medical word for short of breath. Dys means abnormal or painful. Pina or mina, whatever you want to call it, means air, breathing. So dyspnea means short of breath. Let's see what are the ones we have. We have, and the most important one, angina. Angina is clenching. It's a clenching pain in your chest. I'm sure everyone has had a situation of angina in their life before. It's when you get a very, very, I guess clenching is the best way to describe it. You get a clenching pain near your chest, which if you were having a heart attack, it radiates to your left side of your body. So your left arm radiates to your chin and to your chin and your neck. So I'm sure everyone has felt angina before in your life. It's not pleasant. You get it's like a very, very tight clenching pain inside your chest. This happens when your heart runs out of blood, or your not runs out of blood, but your heart has a lack of blood flow for a second. Just like a muscle, every single thing needs blood. If your heart does not get enough blood, it starts to suffocate. That's what angina is. You feel it as a clenching tightness in your chest. So tightness in your chest. So angina, dyspnea, ankylodemia, palpitations, tachycardia mean the same thing. Kind of palpitations mean your heart rate is fluttering. It's beating extremely fast, or you're skipping a beat, or technically, palpitations means you can hear your heartbeat. If you can hear your heartbeat, that's usually not good. Maybe it can be for some other reason, but usually it's not good if you can hear your heartbeat or if it's skipping counts, whatever. Tachycardia, very fast heart rate. Syncope. Syncope means you faint, you pass out. Not good, obviously. Intermediate claudications are, it's like angina, but it's angina in your butt or in your legs. Not good. Unusual fatigue, heart murmurs, or orthopnea. Orthopnea we went over. Unusual fatigue, if it's unusual, that's not good. Heart murmurs. She listed heart murmurs. I wouldn't consider heart murmurs as a symptom of heart disease because it can be benign, which means not harmful. But again, these are all symptoms of heart disease. If the case study says they have angina, they have dyslipidemia, they have ankylodemias, they fainted before, they get fatigued unusually fast, or they have heart murmurs or whatever, then they're immediately considered high risk. Now, the tachycardia one, she's not going to say the tachycardic. She usually gives the heart rate in all the case studies of like 60, 80, 90. Well, you have to know what tachycardia means. It means a heart rate of above 100 at rest. If the heart rate is above 100 at rest, the tachycardic. I am saying this because I missed a question like this on the first test. First test was case study, blah, blah, blah. They have this, their blood pressure is this, blah, blah, blah. I answered everything in complete detail, all excited, all happy for myself. I'm like, oh, look, Dr. P, I'm really smart. I included all these things. Yet I got the whole question wrong because they were high risk because they were tachycardic. It said his heart rate is 101. I did not catch that. It's a fast mistake because you just you scan through these things. So I'm saying that because I missed it. Anyone can miss it. She might say that. She might include that again. Now, 8, how do the risk factors play in for an MD mean present exercise test? The whole point of these risk factors is to assess a patient and see what is a risk for heart disease. Are they low risk, medium risk, or high risk? And depending what the risk is, this determines if it's safe to exercise them, if they need MD's approval, or if they can do an exercise that's vigorous or very intense, or what. Now, if they're low risk, They don't have to go to a doctor's. They don't need an MD's permission. They can do anything they want to do. It's pretty much a green light to do whatever the hell you want to do with them. You can train them any way you want to do. They can do moderate exercise. They can do vigorous exercise, like a VO2 test. They don't need an MD's approval. What are the other ones? Or to do a submax test and a maximal test. So like a cyclogometer when you guys do it, if you haven't done it yet, or a VO2 test. They don't need an MD's approval. They can do whatever they want. Now, if they're medium risk, they can do moderate exercise, but they can't do vigorous exercise without MD's approval. They can do a submax test, but they can't do a maximal test without MD's approval. So pretty much moderate, common sense. You can do, if they're medium risk, you can do moderate exercise, but you can't stress them too far until you got MD's approval, so you know for sure that they're safe to exercise. Now, if they're high risk, they can't do moderate exercise, they can't do vigorous exercise until they get MD's approval. They have to go to the hospital, or they have to have an MD has to say they can exercise. Now, they can't do a submax test on a cyclogometer or whatever submax test you want to do, or a maximal test until they get MD's approval. Again, it's all very common sense. If you're high risk, if someone had a heart attack before, just think about it as you're a personal trainer or you're a health profession, and a patient comes to you and they are high risk, which means they've had a heart attack, say 2 years ago, or they have diabetes. Well, what that tells you is you don't want to be responsible for anything that happens to them. Because if they've had a heart attack before, what's stopping them from having a heart attack again? If they've had it before, they can probably have it again. If they have diabetes, well, that's a medical condition, an existing medical condition. You don't want to proceed with exercise until you make sure the diabetes is under control. So you will have them go to a physician, who the physician says, then the physician will say they're okay to exercise. So then you can do what you want with them. So you use common sense. If someone's low risk, like you find a friend in class and you want to be your personal trainer, well, there might be low risk, but again, you have to assess the risk factors. But if they're low risk, you can do whatever you want with them. You can train them any way they want, because if they're low risk, them having a heart attack is probably a very, 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 very small concern for you. So they don't need MD's approval. They can do whatever they want. If they're moderate risk, it's better to be safe than sorry. So you can make them get a physician for vigorous exercise. But now the reason why, now question 7 and question 8 are the most important questions, because she won't flat out give you a multiple choice question that says well, actually she might, but she'll give you a multiple choice question like, it'll be like a mini case study, and then she'll say, does an MD need to be present for a stress test? Stress test is a fancy word for a maximal test in a hospital or a submax test. It's not too specific if it's maximal, submax. So you have to look in the question, find all the risk factors, calculate them, and then you have to know what the risk factors mean. What does it mean if they need an MD present? How does it affect that? And then you can answer the question. Again, this is a conceptual class. You have to know the concepts. You can't memorize anything in this class. You can, but you probably won't do too good when you have to actually write short answers. Okay. So question 9 is pretty much the same thing. How do you classify individuals as low risk, medium, moderate risk, or high risk? Low risk is 1 risk factor or 0 risk factors, or even negative 1 risk factors. Then the low risk, you can do whatever you want with them. They can do moderate exercise, they can do vigorous exercise, they can do a submax test, they can do a maximal test. They don't need a physician's approval because they're already extremely healthy. If they're moderate risk, they have 2 risk factors or more. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They can have all 8 risk factors and still be considered moderate risk. If they're moderate, they can do moderate exercise. Just realize that if they're moderate risk, yeah, they can do moderate exercise. That's an easy way for you to memorize it. If they're moderate, they can do moderate exercise with no physician. But if they're moderate, they need a physician's approval to do vigorous exercise. And the same thing with the submax test. They can do a submax test, but not a maximal test. If they're high risk, they can't do anything. You can't touch them until they get physician's approval, because you don't know what condition they're in. 10, we already went over how to calculate BMI. 11, we'll talk about everything. 11's on EKGs. No EKG limbs for chest lead, blah, blah, blah. Know all the waves. Calculate heart rate on EKG, axis deviation, all that good stuff. We'll skip all those questions until the end when we'll go over specific questions. 15, know the equation for cardiac output in VO2 max. Okay. So 15, know the equations for cardiac output and VO2 max. This is what the class was about. Cardiac output and VO2 max. This is what I think the most interesting subject in exercise physiology. This is what the whole subject is about. How exercise affects your body, how it makes it better. Well, cardiac output, well, we all know the heart is what supplies our body with blood. It beats every single day. It beats every single minute at a certain time, every single day. It never stops beating or you die. Heart supplies blood everywhere. And cardiac output is the measure of how much blood the heart pumps per minute. So in order to assess cardiac output, what they do is there's a formula, but pretty much however much blood the heart pumps per minute, that's cardiac output. So you can be thinking, well, if this number is higher, that means the heart pumps more blood per minute. If blood is good for our muscles, it's what fuels our muscles, it gives oxygen to our muscles. It makes sense if you have a higher cardiac output, you're in better shape, you're fitter. And that's exactly what it is if you're exercising, which we'll go over. But if you're exercising and you take someone who has a very high cardiac output when they're exercising, well, most likely they're an elite, or they can exercise, they're much fitter because they have a higher cardiac output. The heart can pump more blood every single minute. VO2 max is a measure of how much oxygen your body can take every single minute. A higher number of VO2 is a good indication because if this number is higher, say if it's 40 versus 60, well, someone with a VO2 of 60 means I don't think you know the units, but if someone with a VO2 of 60 versus someone with a VO2 of 40, well, that 60 person, what that means is their body can, who is that? Oh, if someone with a VO2 of 60, that means their body can take in 60 milliliters of 60 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight. So the body is much more efficient at using oxygen. So that's just a simple definition of what these things are. Now the formula for these, cardiac output, this is one of the most important formulas you need to know. Cardiac output, or CO or Q, and I've seen it both different ways, but it's usually CO equals heart rate, HR, times stroke volume, SV. Now you can memorize this formula or you can use common sense and know the concepts. Heart rate is how much beat, well, heart rate is very simple, it's how many times your heart beats per minute. You can feel your heart rate just by doing this. You can feel your heart rate, or you can feel your heart rate right here in your apex of your heart. You can feel your heart rate either way. So how many times your heart beats per minute. Stroke volume is how much blood your left ventricle, which is the biggest chamber of your heart, pumps out every single beat. So with every single heart rate, so 1, 2, 3, with every single heart rate, that's how many times your heart beats. With every single beat, it pumps out a certain volume of blood called stroke volume. Now, it makes sense if cardiac output is the total volume of blood that your heart pumps out every single minute. It makes sense that cardiac output equals your heart rate times your stroke volume. It's a simple multiplication. And you can also look at the units of cardiac output. The units are liter divided by liters per minute. So liters per minute. So it must be something with beat, heart rate. So heart rates are beats per minute times stroke volume, which is in milliliters per minute. So you do whatever your heart rate is, whatever your stroke volume is, and you multiply those together, and you get your cardiac output. So that's what cardiac output is. So just by looking at those formula, if you increase your heart rate, you're going to increase your cardiac output. If you increase your stroke volume, you're going to increase your cardiac output because they're they're proportional, positively proportional. I think I made that up, but they're proportional. So you increase one, you increase the other. Now what VO2 is? VO2 is equal to cardiac output times AV atrial venous return. Atrial venous return you don't know too much about. That's gone over more in exercise physiology, but cardiac output times AV return. Cardiac output, we already know, heart rate times stroke volume, blood per minute. AV return is how much oxygen you have left in that you don't absorb. You don't have to know too much specifics about that, too many specifics. So VO2 equals CO, cardiac output, times AV return, atrial venous return.
Now you can simplify this even more because since cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume to VO2 equals heart rate times stroke volume times atrial venous return. Just know that those formulas are the same thing. You can be asked either way. Now by looking at this formula, if you increase your heart rate and if you increase your heart rate or you increase your stroke volume, you increase your cardiac output, which will increase your VO2. If you increase your atrial venous return, you're going to increase your VO2. It's all looking at proportions. You can memorize everything about how, because I'm saying this because when you get to how does exercise affect this, how does it affect this, how does it affect this. If you just look at the formulas, you see what happens to one thing, you can usually see what happens to every single thing, everything else, without knowing why it's happening in the body. Just look at the formulas. So what that does is take us to question 16. Why does heart rate increase when one is going from supine, sitting that laying down, to standing? Everyone knows this. If well, you might not know it, but everyone's experienced it. If you lay down, your heart rate is lower than when you stand up. You can go test it. No one's heart rate is higher when they're laying down when they're standing, regardless of what they're doing or what shape they're in. The reason for this is because when you're laying down, your heart rate is lower because if you think about the function of the heart, the function of the heart is to supply blood throughout the whole body with every single beat. Every single beat is supplying blood throughout the whole body. Well, if you're laying down, your blood, where's your blood? Your blood doesn't have to go throughout your whole body because what's blood doing if you're laying down? Blood is being pulled into your chest by gravity because you're not standing, so blood's pooled inside your chest area. If blood is pooled in your chest area, your heart rate is lower because your heart does not have to pump as many times per minute to get blood throughout all the organs because the blood's pooled in your chest area. So your heart rate is lower. Now, if your heart rate is, first we'll go over cardiac. Cardiac output is the same for everyone at rest. It's between 5 and 6 liters per minute. Again, that can vary depending on the individual, but everyone's cardiac output, which is liters per minute, how much blood their body cycles per minute, is equivalent at rest, between 5 liters and 6 liters. So you take a world-class athlete and someone that's not a world-class athlete, just a couch potato, their cardiac output is the same at rest. And we'll go over why in a second, but their cardiac output is the same at rest. So just know cardiac output is equivalent to everyone at rest. Now you take someone laying down. If their cardiac output is it's equal whether laying down or staying up, their body's still cycling the same amount of blood per minute. So it's equal. So if they're laying down and their heart rate is lower, look at the formula. If their cardiac output is equal and their heart rate is lower, well, clearly their stroke volume has to be higher in order to make up for that lower heart rate. And that's what happens when you're laying down. Your stroke volume is higher because your heart rate is lower. So it has to make up for that difference. Now, when you're standing, your heart rate increases. The reason it increases because now your heart has to beat harder in order to get blood to your legs, in order to get blood everywhere, because blood is not pooling into your chest now. And since your heart rate is lower, your stroke volume will be, when your heart rate is higher, your stroke volume will be lower because your cardiac output is the same. So that's what happens when you go from supine to standing. Reason for this, because your body's laying down, all the blood's focused in the torso region because of gravity, so the heart does not have to beat as much since the blood is not moving throughout the whole body. When you're laying down, you don't need blood to every single muscle because your legs are not contracting, so your legs do not need as much blood as they do when they're standing. Only your chest, only your heart really needs blood and certain muscles that you're moving when you're laying down. So it doesn't have to beat as much. But when you're standing, you need blood to circulate your whole body, so thus it has to beat many more times per minute, or has to beat harder. Again, easy way to look at relationships, look at the formulas. Cardiac output stays the same, so when heart rate lowers, stroke volume must increase if you want to maintain the same cardiac output. Question 17 is know what diastolic means, systolic and mean arterial pressure, simple definitions. And MAP is mean arterial pressure, pulse pressure is PP. RPP is an important subject that will be on probably every single test. She probably said in class that you have to know what RPP means. She's not lying. It will be on the test. A very simple question: what does RPP mean, or how do you calculate RPP? RPP means rate pressure product. It's an indirect measure of oxygen consumption in the heart. The higher your RPP is, that means your heart is working harder. So, systolic blood pressure is the pressure that blood is exerting on your arteries when the heart first contracts. So the heart's constantly contracting. Every time the heart contracts, it propels blood throughout your arteries to all your organs. And obviously, when you propel blood through an enclosed space like an artery, it's going to increase the pressure of the artery. Well, when your heart first contracts, it pushes the blood forcibly. What's the word? I don't know, but it pushes it forcibly through the artery. So when it first contracts, it's going to propel the blood, and this is going to give a really high pressure. This is called the systolic blood pressure. That's why when you take someone's blood pressure, the high blood pressure 120/80, 120 is systolic because that's the pressure of blood in the arteries when the heart first contracts. If it was 140/80, that means our pressure of the heart, the pressure in the arteries was 140. 160, it's 160. Obviously, you don't want too high of a pressure because that's bad for the arteries. Can't withstand that pressure. Diastolic blood pressure is the pressure in the heart when the heart's resting. That's why it's always lower, because when your heart's resting, clearly the pressure is not going to be as high as it was when it's contracting, so it's going to be lower. Thus, it's low. It's 80. For an athlete, it's like mine's like 60 or something, so it's really low. Because the reason it's low is because your heart is resting, so why would it have a high pressure? Mean arterial pressure, or MAP, is, again, the definition for mean arterial pressure isn't really given. It's just an average pressure. Mean arterial pressure, mean means average. It's the average pressure in the arteries. Systolic blood pressure is the pressure when your heart first contracts, but your arteries are very, very long, so your heart's going to contract, propel blood. That highest pressure it gets when it contracts is called systolic blood pressure. But as it continues throughout the arteries and goes throughout the body, pressure is going to decrease. Now, the mean arterial pressure is the mean pressure in the arteries. Now, there's 3 ways to calculate this. There's one invasive way, which means they have to take a muscle biopsy. Not, they can't take a biopsy, but they have to stick a needle inside you or a tracer or something, do something invasive. The invasive way obviously isn't done a lot unless someone's in a hospital. But the invasive way equals cardiac output times TPR. Sorry, I forgot it for a second, but it's cardiac output times TPR. TPR means total peripheral resistance. TPR is the resistance to blood flow. Okay, I'm not going to go over what TPR exactly means and why it's high when it decreases, because I think that's gotten over in the 3rd test or the 2nd test when you go over myocardial infarctions. But TPR is resistance to blood flow. So mean arterial pressure, MAP, is equivalent to cardiac output times mean arterial pressure. That's the invasive way. Now, the non-invasive ways that you can calculate just by asking someone their numbers, there's 2 ways. You can do 1/3 parentheses systolic blood pressure minus diastolic blood pressure. So the difference between systolic and diastolic, parentheses, plus diastolic blood pressure. And if it's 1/3, and then if their heart rate is below 100, you use 1/3. If their heart rate is above 100, you use 1/2. And you're gonna have to know this because this might be a question. It won't be in a case study. Well, it might be in a case study. I don't know. It might be a question where she says, "What is this person's mean arterial pressure?" Well, you have to calculate it, and it's not good enough just saying a number. You have to actually do the calculations. So write everything down. So it's 1/3 minus systolic blood pressure minus diastolic blood pressure, close parentheses, plus diastolic blood pressure. Or if they're exercising, which means their heart rate is above 100, you times it by 1/2 instead. Ooh. Heart's anatomy, favorite question. Okay, so now the heart again is the most important muscle in the body and most important organ. The heart is essentially a 4-chamber thing. 4 chambers. That's because I don't have a pen. But think of a box. The heart is essentially a box in simplest thing. It has 4 chambers, and it's situated right here on the left side of your body. So we have 4 chambers. 1, 2, 3, 4. You have 2 top chambers and 2 bottom chambers. The top chambers are called atria. The bottom chambers are called ventricles. You have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. You have a right atrium and a left atrium, and a right ventricle and a left ventricle. Now, the blood flow through the heart is a closed loop, which means that whatever blood your heart pumps out in volume, your heart is always going to return back to the heart. You're never going to lose blood through any part of the body. It's always a loop, just like a hose. So we'll just pick any part of the body. Since it's a closed loop, it just keeps continuing. We'll pick blood going back into the heart. Now, blood returns back to the heart from the body, returns to the veins by the inferior vena cava down here and the superior vena cava. Those are the largest veins in the body. Superior vena cava brings all the blood from above your heart. The inferior vena cava brings all the blood below your heart. So these enter into the right atrium, which collects all the deoxygenated blood because all the oxygen went to all the organs. So it collects all the deoxygenated blood. All this blood now is in this chamber, the right atrium. So now it has to fall down into the right ventricle, which is underneath it. Now it has 4 chambers. A door separates each chamber. So it has to fall down this door, which is called the tricuspid, or it's a valve, which is called a tricuspid valve. So it has to fall down this tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. And then once all the blood gets into the right ventricle, it's still deoxygenated. Now it's pumped to the lungs, which are like right here. It's pumped to the lungs via the pulmonary artery. Not the pulmonary vein, pulmonary artery. So it enters the right ventricle, it's pumped to the lungs via the pulmonary artery. In the lungs, it picks up all the oxygen that we breathe, and then it's pumped into the left atrium via the pulmonary vein. So now it's the oxygenated, it's red, it's in the left atrium. So now, just like in the right atrium, you have to get down to the right ventricle, you have to get from the left atrium down to the left ventricle. So it falls down the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. Now, the bicuspid valve is also called the mitral valve, so it can be called either way, but they're the same thing. They separate the right left atrium from the left ventricle. So it falls down that valve into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it's pumped out the aorta, throughout the arteries, throughout the whole body. Now, 2 valves I did not mention are these 2 valves are called the semilunar valve, the atrioventricular valves, the tricuspid valve, and the bicuspid valve, or mitral valve. They're the semilunar valves. They're the atrioventricular valves, or AV valves. The other 2 valves are called the semilunar valves. These are the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. The pulmonary valve separates the right ventricle from the lungs. So when blood enters the right ventricle, it pumps out the pulmonary valve, and it pumps through the pulmonary valve, goes to the pulmonary artery to the lungs, gets oxygenated, goes to the pulmonary vein, they go back to the left ventricle, the left atrium, falls down the bicuspidal mitral valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle pumps it out the aortic valve, out the aorta, which is the strongest muscle in the body. It pumps out the aorta, and then the aorta, it goes throughout all the arteries, capillaries, blah blah blah. From the arteries, eventually it goes to capillaries. All the oxygen and everything diffuses out of the blood in the capillaries. So the point of the capillaries is for diffusion. It takes out all the oxygen, everything diffuses out of the blood, goes into the tissues. All the carbon dioxide, all the waste products such as lactic acid, hydrogen ions, nitric oxide, all that stuff enters the blood and the capillaries to be recycled, and you exhale that. Ketones, you exhale all that stuff. So from the capillaries, get back to the heart. Again, instead of going through the arteries, it goes through the veins to get back to the heart. And then it enters the inferior vena cava, the superior vena cava, and it completes the cycle. So those are the basic anatomies of the heart. So roll that. Main organ. Yes. Process completes. Explains everything. Most important part is there's going to be a question. The question is going to probably be like, follow the pathway of blood. So you have to know right atrium, down tricuspid valve, so right ventricle, out the pulmonary valve, throughout the pulmonary artery to the lungs, gets oxygenated, goes to the pulmonary vein, goes to the left atrium, down the bicuspid valve, goes into the left ventricle, pumped out the aortic valve, aorta goes to the arteries, goes to the capillaries, goes to the veins, blah blah blah. Cycle continues. Question 19 is what happens to systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, heart rate, rate pressure product, mean pressure product, pulse pressure, cardiac output, stroke volume, and VO2. What happens to pretty much all the factors we learn once you start exercising? So these are one of the most important questions. Actually, these questions are pretty much, this is the whole point of exercise testing, exercise physiology, knowing how exercise affects all these values. So this question is concerning what happens immediately when you start exercising. When you start exercising, from experience, what happens once you start exercising? When you start exercising, you start sweating more, you start breathing hard, your heart rate starts increasing. And that's one thing, your heart rate increases when you start exercising. So since your heart rate increases, your cardiac output increases because cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. So again, that's 2 things right there. Cardiac output increases, heart rate increases. Your stroke volume also increases. Because when you start exercising, your body needs more blood with every single beat. So your stroke volume increases. If you just think of, okay, so my body is an organ, what does my body need now that I'm exercising? Well, if you're exercising, your muscles need more blood. They need more oxygen. So it makes sense that your heart is going to beat faster. That's why it beats faster, is because you need more blood to supply the exercise you're doing. Your stroke volume increases because you need more blood and oxygen to supply exercise with every single beat of your heart. So your stroke volume increases and you pump out more blood with every single beat. That's why when you're at rest, your heart rate isn't really high because you're resting. You don't need a lot of blood flow to your muscles. So your heart only beats as fast as it has to beat. Your heart rate, what else? Okay, so now we'll just go down the list, I guess. Systolic blood pressure will increase. If you know what systolic blood pressure is, it's the highest pressure in your arteries when your heart first contracts. Well, if you think about all these values, it makes sense that your systolic blood pressure will increase. If your heart rate is increasing, your heart's beating faster. If your stroke volume is increasing, you're pumping out more blood with every single beat, then your systolic blood pressure must increase, because systolic blood pressure is a measure of the pressure of blood when it leaves the heart. If you're pumping out more blood with every single heartbeat, the pressure is going to be higher with every single beat. So your systolic blood pressure will increase. Now your diastolic blood pressure, which is a trick question, your diastolic blood pressure will not increase. It has no reason to increase. It will actually, if anything, it might decrease a little bit. Reason being is because diastolic blood pressure is a measure of pressure when your heart is resting. Even when you're exercising, your heart is still resting. So why would your pressure be greater when you're resting? So diastolic blood pressure is the same when you're exercising. It might decrease a little bit. If it increases, that's not good. It should not increase because your heart is still resting. Why would pressure increase when you're resting? Heart rate will obviously increase because you're exercising. We all know this. Now, the reason why it increases that she wants to know. Two things control your heart rate, and this is your autonomic nervous system. So two things control it: parasympathetic activity and sympathetic activity. These are antagonists. One decreases heart rate, parasympathetic decreases your heart rate, parasympathetic increases your heart rate. This is one of the main things that increase and decrease your heart rate. It's parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. Parasympathetic activity is from the vagal nerve. So vagal tone, vagus nerve, that's the main parasympathetic stimulation on the heart. It's a nerve that connects somewhere in your hypothalamus over here, connects to your heart. It's the vagus nerve. It tells your heart that pretty much to slow down. So when your heart's beating too fast, or you're resting, or you want your heart rate to slow down, your brain, your medulla oblongata, tells your body. It sends something, a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. It sends it down to your heart and through the vagus nerve, and it's going to tell your heart, yo, chill out, stop contracting. You don't need to be contracting as much. Slow down. So the more parasympathetic activity you have, the stronger your vagal tone is. That's what they call it. The slower your heart rate is going to be. That's why you take someone, well, we'll go over this later, but the more parasympathetic activity you have, the slower your heart rate is going to be. Now, sympathetic activity is the opposite. This is going to increase your heart rate. Sympathetic activity is adrenaline, which is another word for epinephrine, and norepinephrine. These work to increase your heart rate. These are fight or flight. These are the fight or flight mechanisms. They're going to increase your heart rate. Adrenaline, it's going to make you ready to fight. It's going to increase everything. So when you exercise, and your body is now, instead of releasing acetylcholine in your medulla, now it's going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's going to tell your heart that now I have to beat faster and whatnot, get ready to exercise. So now my body, my muscles need more blood and oxygen. How am I going to accomplish this? I'm going to accomplish this by beating faster and pumping out more blood. So let me release norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay, you don't know the specific enzymes, it's not exercise physiology, but norepinephrine and epinephrine, let me increase them to tell my heart rate to increase and start beating faster. So that's what sympathetic activity is. And now the cutoffs that you need to know is the reason why above 100 beats and rest is considered tachycardic and below 100 is not. They chose 100, not 90. The reason why is because when we find out about the SA node and the electrical impulse of a heart, the heart normally beats at 60 to 100 beats per minute. That's just, heart is auto-rhythmic. It beats by itself, which is why if you cut someone's heart outside the body, it will beat for a little bit. Of course, if you cut it, it will die, but if you take someone's heart outside the body, it will continue beating. If someone's in a coma, the heart will continue beating. Because it's auto-rhythmic, it makes its own impulses. It does not need the brain to tell it to beat. It beats by itself. It's auto-rhythmic. And it beats by itself every 60 to 100 beats per minute. Now, the thing that controls this is parasympathetic activity. It slows down heart rate. Now, once your heart gets above 100, this is the cutoff to be considered sympathetic activity, or you're considered tachycardic. So, the SA node fires between 60 to 100 beats per minute. Vagal tone is what decreases the heart rate. So, as you start exercising, your heart rate slowly increases. It doesn't jump from 60 to 150. It slowly increases. So as your heart is increased from 60 to 70 to 80 to 100, first what's happening is parasympathetic activity, vagal tone, is decreasing. Because remember, as vagal tone increases, your heart rate slows down. It's sending more information to slow down your heart rate. So as your heart rate increases, as your heart rate increases, parasympathetic activity decreases as you get to 100 beats per minute. Now, once you cross 100 beats per minute, parasympathetic activity is gone. Now, in order to speed your heart rate even more than 100 beats per minute, you need sympathetic activity. You need norepinephrine and epinephrine to increase your heart rate even more. So, the important thing to know, the cutoff is when you first start exercising, the thing that's going to increase your heart rate is not sympathetic activity. It's going to be a decrease in parasympathetic activity until you get to 100 beats per minute. Once you get to 100 beats per minute, then your sympathetic nervous system, your epinephrine, your norepinephrine will take over and increase your heart rate even more all the way up to your maximum heart rate, which is probably 190 for your age. So first your parasympathetic... No. No. So first your parasympathetic activity will decrease, and then your sympathetic activity will decrease. Now, a fact that she says that she probably told you guys is for a heart transplant patient. Now, when someone has a heart transplant, they have to sever their vagus nerve. There's no way around that. Your vagus nerve is one of the things that attaches pretty much attaches your body to your heart, and it keeps your heart inside your body. So, in order to transplant your heart, you have to sever this nerve, and there's no way to repair it. So you sever it. So what that means is you sever your parasympathetic activity or your vagus nerve. So you have no way to get acetylcholine to your heart. So your medulla oblongata cannot communicate with your heart to slow it down, which is why a heart transplant patient will usually always have a very high heart rate at rest. It might be 90, it might be 100. It's usually high at rest. And that's normal for them because they have a heart transplant. They don't have that parasympathetic activity to slow down their heart rate. So what that means is when they first start exercising, their heart rate is going to increase extremely fast because they don't have that parasympathetic activity to slowly decrease to increase their heart rate. Their heart rate is already going to start like at probably 110 beats per minute and thus increases very fast. So that's one thing that if you do become a physical therapist or a personal trainer and you are training someone that had a heart transplant, their heart rate is going to increase extremely fast because of this reason. So that's what's important about heart rate. First, parasympathetic activity decreases, which raises your heart rate and then once it gets to 100 beats per minute, sympathetic activity will take over and increase your heart rate even more. Now for stroke volume. Stroke volume will increase when you start exercising. The reason for that is very simple. If you think about it, your body is exercising, so it needs more blood, it needs more oxygen. So it's going to pump out, your heart is going to pump out more blood and more oxygen. Well, oxygen is with blood, so it's going to pump out more blood, which makes sense. So just think about what the body needs when it's exercising. It needs more blood, so it's going to accomplish that by pumping out more blood, so thus your stroke volume will increase. Now the reason it increases due to two reasons. I'm not sure exactly how many reasons she said, but two very important reasons that you have to know. One, I believe it's the catecholamines. The catecholamines are epinephrine and norepinephrine to a certain extent. Just like how they speed heart rate, they increase your stroke volume, but they're not really important. They don't really play a big role in that. One big role is calcium. If you remember from muscle contraction, calcium is what causes muscle contraction. If you have no calcium, you can't contract your muscles. If you have a lot of calcium, you'll contract your muscles. So it makes sense if you have more calcium, your muscles will contract faster. That's what, your heart is just like a muscle, it contracts. Every time it beats, it contracts. The harder it contracts, the more blood it pushes out with every single beat. So just think of it as like a hose. If water is going through a hose, it's going in a stream, whatever. If you put your thumb over the hose, it goes out faster because that's a bad example maybe, but it contracts more, so it pushes out more blood. It pushes out faster, contracts harder. So more calcium increases the contractility. That's what it's called in the heart. Contractility is how fast, or a measure of how the heart contracts. A higher contractility means it contracts harder, it contracts more forcibly, it pumps out more blood. Pumps out more blood, it will increase your stroke volume. So that's one way. You increase calcium, which increases contractility. Another way is called the Frank-Starling mechanism. I don't know how much in details you went, but the Frank-Starling mechanism is irrelevant to any other thing. The Frank-Starling mechanism just happens. What this means is okay, so it's just like a closed loop. So you start exercising, your heart starts beating faster, and it pumps out more blood from stroke volume because it's beating faster. So now you have a greater volume of blood. As more blood returns to the heart, it's called venous return. More blood returns to the heart, you have more blood. More blood enters the chamber of the heart, of the left ventricle, and the heart is chambers. So since more blood enters, it stretches. So think of a rubber band. It stretches. As more blood enters the left ventricle, it'll stretch more. That's what the Frank-Starling mechanism is essentially. It says as more blood enters, it stretches. Now, the more blood entering the heart, the word they use is they have is end diastolic volume, or EDV. End diastolic volume is the amount of blood that enters the left ventricle. As you have a higher end diastolic volume, your chamber will stretch more and more and more because it has more and more blood in it. And this is a result of exercise. It just happens. As you exercise, you have more blood in your body. You're pumping more blood. So since you're pumping more blood enters your left ventricle. And since more blood enters your left ventricle, it's going to stretch more. And just like a rubber band, if you stretch your rubber band harder, it's going to contract much more forcibly. And that's what the heart does. So as the heart stretches more and more, it contracts much more forcibly. And as it contracts more forcibly, it pumps out more blood. This is called the Frank-Starling mechanism. Frank-Starling mechanism says as more blood enters the heart, or as your EDV, your end diastolic volume increases, your heart is going to stretch your left ventricle, and as your left ventricle stretches, it pumps out more blood. It stretches more. Think of a rubber band. You stretch your rubber band more, it's going to pump more forcibly and pump out more blood. Up to an extent. Obviously, if you stretch your rubber band too much, it's going to break, or it's going to break. If you stretch the heart too much, it's not going to be effective. That's what heart failure is, which we don't have to go over. But Frank-Starling mechanism says as you exercise more, you increase your end diastolic volume, or the blood that enters the heart. As more blood enters the left ventricle of the heart, it stretches more. As it stretches more, it contracts harder. As it contracts harder, it pumps out more blood. Cycle continues. That's the Frank-Starling mechanism. That's one way that the body increases stroke volume. It's just a passive effect of exercise. Another way is through calcium. That's just through exercise. As you muscles contract more and more, or as you're exercising, your body senses your exercise is just going to release more calcium. Calcium increases contractility, which works with Frank-Starling mechanism, but they're independent processes to increase how much blood you propel. So end diastolic volume increases. No EDV, end diastolic volume. ESV, in systolic volume, is how much blood remains in the heart after it beats, after it pumps out the blood. End diastolic volume is also called preload. Makes sense. Preload is how much blood enters before your heart, so pre-contraction. This is increased mainly by venous return, as we went over. We pretty much said, but we didn't use the word venous return. It's how much blood returns to the heart. If you increase your venous return, you're returning more blood to the heart. If you're returning more blood to the heart, it's going to increase preload, stretch more, contract more. Okay, so now everything else, after you understand that heart rate increases, stroke volume increases, thus cardiac output increases, Systolic blood pressure increases. Diastolic blood pressure stays the same. That makes it very easy to see what happens to everything else. Again, just plug it all into formulas. The formula for cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. If heart rate is increasing and stroke volume is increasing, cardiac output must increase because they're proportional. Now for rate pressure product. Rate pressure product, again, you can know the definition, the indirect measure of oxygen consumption by the heart. Obviously, if you exercise and your heart is using more oxygen, so rate pressure product must increase, or you can look at the formula. The formula is heart rate times systolic blood pressure divided by 100. Well, heart rate is increasing, systolic blood pressure is increasing. 100 is obviously 100, it's a constant. Proportions, systolic rate pressure product increases. Now, there's no unit for rate pressure product, it's just a number. So on a case study, when she asks you what is the rate pressure product, well, you take heart rate times the stroke volume and just put the number. There's no units. If you put a unit, you're going to get it wrong, even if you had the right number, because you got the concept wrong. Pulse pressure, looking at the formula, pulse pressure, I didn't even go over it, but pulse pressure is the difference between systolic blood pressure minus diastolic blood pressure. Look at the formula. Systolic blood pressure increases, diastolic blood pressure stays the same, so pulse pressure must increase, proportional. VO2 will increase. Look at the formula. The formula is cardiac output times AV return. Well, cardiac output is increasing. We've already confirmed that. AV return, we didn't really go over, but that sort of increases when you start exercising. But since cardiac output is increasing, your VO2 must increase. Or you can break it down to VO2 equals heart rate times stroke volume times AV return. Heart rate's increasing, stroke volume's increasing, VO2 must increase. Look at the formulas. Next one is MAP, mean anterior pressure. Look at the formula. If you're exercising, your heart rate is probably above 100, but again, the formula is 1/2 parentheses systolic minus diastolic parentheses plus diastolic. Well, systolic is increasing, diastolic staying the same, so mean arterial pressure must increase. Look at the formulas. Okay, 20, know the physiological difference between the trained and untrained state at rest, at relative, and maximum exercise. Again, all these good things that we just went over. Okay, so you have to know what relative exercise means, you have to know what maximal exercises mean. Relative exercise means, well, first you have to take two states. So take someone, okay, so we use running at 6 miles an hour. Take a person running at 6 miles an hour. They run 6 miles an hour at something, blah, blah, blah. They train for 6 months and they run 6 miles. Okay, no, that's an example of that, of maximum, sorry. Relative means at the same percentage of your VO2. So take someone, they exercise at 70% of the VO2 or 70% of the heart rate. It's usually measured by VO2. So take someone that's, you exercise them at 70% of the VO2. They run on a treadmill, maximum test at 70% of the VO2, whatever. They train for 6 months. 6 months later, they exercise again at 70% of the VO2. How do these values differ? How does the heart rate differ? The stroke volume, the cardiac output, the VO2, parasympathetic activity, sympathetic activity. How does all these things differ? Well, which one did I choose first? Okay, well, clearly I went in the wrong order. I start with rest on my study guide, so I'll start with rest again. So forget everything about the relative exercise. So rest obviously means you're resting. So take a professional athlete, a professional runner, and take someone who, take a couch potato. Take two people, a fit athlete and a couch potato. How do their values differ at rest? Well, the athlete will have a lower heart rate at rest. The reason for this is the purpose of your heart rate is to supply your body with oxygen and blood. If someone is very, very fit, the heart is stronger. So if the heart is stronger, it pumps out more blood with every single beat. So it doesn't have to pump as much since it already pumps out enough blood. So the heart rate is actually lower if you take a fit athlete and an unfit athlete. That's why a lot of people have heart rates like around 45, 50, mine's like 35. Your heart rate is very low at rest, but you take someone who's not in exercise science, who takes someone who's in biology or someone in whatever, a different major. Their heart rate is probably like 70 when at rest if you take the heart rate. The reason for this is because The exercise science person is fitter, so their heart has to work not as much. The heart is stronger, so it doesn't have to work as much when they're resting to supply the same amount of blood to the body that the body requires at rest. So the heart rate is lower. Since the heart rate is lower, the stroke volume will be higher. Because why would a fit athlete have a lower stroke volume? Stroke volume is how much blood you pump every single beat. So if your heart rate is lower, your stroke volume has to be higher. The reason being because your cardiac output is the same regardless of your fitness. It is the same because everyone requires the same amount of blood at rest. You take one body that's at rest, you take another body at rest. Well, their muscles require the same amount of oxygen, the same amount of blood, so the cardiac output is going to be the exact same. Now, if you take someone who has a cardiac condition and who has heart failure, well, that's different. But take two people at rest, regardless of the fitness, they're going to have the same exact cardiac output, plus or minus a few milliliters, but it's going to be the same cardiac output. So, since a fit person at rest has a lower heart rate, but the same cardiac output, they're going to have a higher stroke volume. So that answers some questions right there. Trained athlete will have a lower heart rate. The reason why is because they have more vagal tone. They have more parasympathetic activity. Remember, parasympathetic activity is your brain telling your heart, stop beating so much. You don't need to beat this much. You're wasting energy because every time the heart beats, it uses ATP or energy. If your heart is strong enough not to beat as much at rest, why would the heart continue to beat when it doesn't need to beat as much? So your brain through the vagal tone will tell your heart to stop beating as much. So you have more vagal tone. Since you have a lower heart rate, you have a higher stroke volume because the stroke volume will increase because heart rate is decreasing. Look at the formula. And again, she'll give reasons why they have higher stroke volume. They have a higher stroke volume because they have a higher blood volume. They have a higher plasma volume, and the ventricular volume is great. What this means is ventricular volume means it's just like a muscle, the chamber actually gets bigger when you exercise to a certain extent. So the ventricular volume is greater, but the main important thing is they have a higher plasma volume and they have a higher blood volume. So a fit athlete actually has more blood in their body. I won't go to the mechanism of that, but a fit athlete actually has more blood. So if they have more blood, they're pumping out more blood with every single beat. Cardiac output is the same. VO2 is the same. You can derive everything from this formula. As if cardiac output is the same, VO2 must be the same because VO2 equals cardiac output times AV return. Mean arterial pressure is the same compared to a fit athlete and unfit athlete because mean arterial pressure equals 1/3 stroke volume, 1/3 systolic blood pressure minus diastolic blood pressure plus diastolic blood pressure. Mean arterial pressure is the same because blood pressure does decrease when you exercise, but it's usually significant. It's not to a great extent. So your mean arterial pressure is probably the same regardless if you're fit or unfit. Rate pressure product will decrease because, again, looking at the formulas, rate pressure product equals heart rate times systolic blood pressure divided by 100. Well, your heart rate is decreasing when you're fit, so your rate pressure product will decrease. Parasympathetic activity will increase because your heart rate is decreasing, so you have more parasympathetic activity when you're fit. Sympathetic activity will decrease. Parasympathetic activity and sympathetic activity are antagonists. Is if your parasympathetic activity increases, your sympathetic activity will decrease. Now we'll look at what happens during maximal exercise. Now when you're exercising at your maximum rate, you take two athletes. You take a very, very fit athlete and someone who's not that fit. But if they're exercising at maximal rate, what happens to all these values? Well, heart rate actually stays the same. Now this is the only thing that can throw you off. You would think, well, if you're at maximal exercise, your heart rate will why wouldn't it increase? The reason for this is your heart does increase when you exercise. Your heart rate does increase, but when you get to maximal exercise, 100% of your exercise, what that means is your body is at its max. Your heart is at its max. It cannot beat any faster. So your heart rate does not increase at maximal exercise. Reason being because your heart rate is a formula. I mean, your max heart rate is a formula. It's 220 minus your age. That's a rough formula, but your heart rate decreases with age, your maximal heart rate. So no amount of training will increase your maximal heart rate. So you can never increase your maximal heart rate. Once you get to your max, you can't increase it. It'll decrease with age. Now, the thing that separates a fit athlete at maximal exercise, so you take Usain Bolt, or that's, I don't know, just say Usain Bolt. It's the only example I can think of right now. At max exercise. The reason that at maximum exercise he is still faster at his max than you are at your max. You guys might be the same exact age, and say you guys have the same exact max heart rate. The reason he's faster and you're not, you're probably thinking, well, we have the same exact heart rate. Why is he faster than me and I'm slower? The reason being is because he has the same heart rate, but he has a much higher stroke volume. Because stroke volume is the thing that separates a elite athlete from someone not so elite, or a fit athlete from someone that's not fit. Stroke volume is the main thing because heart rate is constant usually between individuals. Training doesn't really change your heart rate, but stroke volume is what increases greatly with training. So stroke and maximal exercise compared to an unfit athlete and a fit athlete, stroke volume is what increases. Stroke volume is what drives everything. It's what makes you fit. You have a higher stroke volume. So stroke volume will increase. So because heart rate is not increasing, stroke volume has to increase because cardiac output increases. That makes sense because at a maximal effort, your cardiac output will still increase. Obviously, you take a fit athlete, Usain Bolt, and you take you. He has a higher cardiac output than you. His body is more efficient at pumping blood. He pumps much more blood out every single minute to supply his muscles with oxygen and blood. Reason being because he has a much higher stroke volume. Since his heart rate is the same as yours and max effort, why does he have a higher cardiac output? Because he has a higher stroke volume. Look at the formulas. If heart rate is not increasing, stroke volume must increase to increase his cardiac output. VO2 will increase, and then based on his cardiac output increasing, you can derive every single formula. VO2 will increase because cardiac output is increasing. Mean arterial pressure will stay the same. I didn't really list the reason why, just know mean arterial pressure stays the same. Rate pressure product will stay the same because look at the formulas. Heart rate is not increasing, so why would your rate pressure product increase? PNS is the same, SNS is the same. At max effort, your parasympathetic activity is clearly not relevant because you're at maximal effort, so your parasympathetic activity isn't even there, but your sympathetic activity will stay the same. Now, okay, so now the difference between relative exercise and absolute exercise. Relative is take someone, they run at 70% of the VO2. They train for 6 months and they run again at 70% of the VO2. What will be the differences in all these values? Well, which one did I start with? I started with relative. Their heart rate will be the same. The reason why the heart rate will be the same is because 70% of the VO2, 6 months later, 70% of the VO2. Well, the heart rate is going to be the same exact because they're working at the same exact workload. The percentage, the way I think about it and why I teach it is think of as tricking your body. Your body's working at 70% of its VO2, trains, 6 months later it's working at 70% of its VO2. So your body thinks it's the same exact effort because it's the same exact percentage of the VO2. So your body is going to be the same exact percentage of your heart rate. Also, because it thinks it's the same exact effort. So your heart rate is going to be the same, but your stroke volume will increase because, as we know, with training you get fitter. So you take someone, exercise them at 70% of the VO2, they train intensely for 6 months, and they exercise again at 70% of the VO2. Well, their heart rate is the same exact because your body thinks it's the same exact workload. But it's not because hopefully in those 6 months you've gotten in more shape. So 70% of your VO2 now might be faster or more intense. So say you ran a mile at 8-minute pace and that was 70% of your VO2. You train for 6 months and now you run a mile at a 5-minute pace and that's still 70% of your VO2. Well, your body thinks that 5-minute mile is the same intensity as an 8-minute mile because it's the same exact percentage of your VO2. So it has the same exact heart rate. But clearly it's not the same intensity wise, or it's not the same exact workload, so your stroke volume is going to be higher, if that makes sense, because you're in better shape. So the reason why you can go from an 8-minute mile to a 5-minute mile, the same percentage of your VO2, is because you're in more shape, you're fitter. And since you're fitter, your stroke volume will be higher. And since looking at the formula, cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate, your heart rate stays the same, but your stroke volume increases, so your cardiac output will increase. The reason, obviously, it's common sense because you're in better shape, you're running, it's on the same percentage of VO2, but it's faster, it's a bigger workload, so your cardiac output will increase. Mean arterial pressure will stay the same. I think you just have to memorize that. Rate pressure product will stay the same by looking at the formula. Now in absolute intensity means take someone, they run a 6-minute mile. They train for 6 months and they again run a 6-minute mile. What changes in the values? Well, 6-minute mile, train, 6-minute mile. They're running the same exact thing, but they train, they're in better shape. So what happens is their heart rate is actually decreased. It's decreased because their body doesn't have to work as hard to maintain the same exact effort. You run a 6-minute mile, you train, then you run a 6-minute mile again. Well, now your body is in better shape, so it doesn't have to work as hard to maintain that same exact effort. So your heart actually decreases less. Your heart rate decreases. Now, since your heart rate decreases, your stroke volume increases. Because if you're getting more in shape and your heart rate is decreasing, your stroke volume will increase. Because why would you want your stroke volume to decrease? Your heart is getting more efficient at exercise, so it's going to beat faster, it's going to beat harder, your stroke volume increases. And you can also look at the formula. If your heart rate decreases, why would your stroke volume decrease? If your stroke volume also decreases, your cardiac output would decrease. You can think by knowing what cardiac output is, that's detrimental to exercise. So it doesn't make sense why your stroke volume would decrease. Your stroke volume wouldn't stay the same because, again, your cardiac output would decrease by looking at that formula. Now, since heart rate is decreasing and stroke volume is increasing, cardiac output will stay the same. And you can think about that is because if you run a 6-minute mile, train, run another 6-minute mile, your body is performing the same exact work. It will be easier, obviously, because you're in better shape, but it's doing the same exact work regardless. So why would your cardiac output decrease? Your body still needs the same amount of blood, but your heart is just pumping less because it's easier now, but your body still needs the same amount of blood and oxygen. And based on all this stuff, if your cardiac output is staying the same, if your VO2 is staying the same, your rate pressure product will decrease because, again, look at the formula, heart rate times systolic blood pressure. 21 will skip because it's about EKGs. Last two questions before we get to EKGs. What is a metabolic MET? Simple definition. MET is a metabolic equivalent. It's equivalent to 3.5 milliliters times kilograms per minute. Simple definition. MET is not going to be too important on the first test. It will be very important on the second test. We have to do the metabolic equations, but it can be a simple definition, simple multiple choice. What is metabolic syndrome? Metabolic syndrome is not risk factors. Of course, that's the first thing. Get that out of your mind. If you think metabolic syndrome is risk factors, it's not. Metabolic syndrome are just emerging risk factors. It's a completely different classification than risk factors. Metabolic syndrome it's used to classify something else, but it's completely different than risk factors. It's not a disease. In order to have metabolic syndrome, which is just bad, in order to have metabolic syndrome, you need at least 3 of these following. Again, just memorize these. Truncal obesity, you can't really define truncal obesity. Well, it's that whole waist circumference thing, 40 or higher for men, 35 or higher for women. This is where the triglycerides come into place, 150 or higher. Now, triglycerides are not a risk factor, one of the 8 risk factors, but it will be given in a case study. And as you've seen, triglycerides are given in case studies. But if the question says define all the risk factors and if they're low, medium, or high risk, triglycerides does not play any role because triglycerides only count towards metabolic syndrome. So if they're just asking for risk factors, you don't have to list triglycerides. Now, if they ask, do they have metabolic syndrome, then yes, you have to list triglycerides if it's above 150, or even if it's not above 150. LDL less than 40 for men, 50 for women. That's a different cutoff. Blood pressure is a little lower. It's not considered hypertension anymore. It's 130 over 85. Fasting glucose 100 or greater. That's a risk factor anyways. Post-stomach fiber of 150 or higher. That's a number you have to memorize. Different types of diabetes. Diabetes means your body cannot metabolize blood glucose. Normally, you eat food, you have blood sugar, sugar's in your blood. That sugar goes into your cells, you metabolize it to ATP, you lower your blood sugar. That's the process of living. Now, in a diabetic, that blood sugar can't go into the cells, so they can't metabolize it, and it just chills in the blood and builds up in the blood. Well, that's not good. That can lead to many, many problems. So you want to lower your blood sugar. It's a natural process in the body. Well, for some people, if they're diabetic, they can't lower the blood sugar. In order for sugar to enter into your cells, it needs a hormone called insulin. Insulin is like a key that will let sugar or glucose into your cells, which are normally closed and do not let glucose into them. So if your body either does not make insulin, you're diabetic, because if you don't have insulin, glucose can't get into your cells, or if your body is insensitive to insulin, you're diabetic. So your body, your pancreas, makes glucose just fine, but your cells do not react to it. It does not recognize glucose or insulin, or the insulin is just not effective. You're also diabetic. Regardless if you have a high blood sugar, you're diabetic. There's three types of diabetes, but there's type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disease, which means you have to be born with it or through radiation or chemicals or something, but you're mostly born with it. It's genetic. That means your body does not make insulin. You're diabetic, but it was not a risk factor. You did not cause your diabetes, but you're still diabetic. That's type 1 diabetes. You have to take insulin injections because you need insulin in your body. Type 2 diabetes means you caused your diabetes. You screwed up your body. Your body is insulin resistant. It might make insulin just fine, but your cells do not react to that insulin. And it won't go over the pathophysiology of why your body is not reacting to the insulin, but your body is not reacting to the insulin, even though it makes it so you're type 2 diabetic. So you might need to take insulin injections if you don't make insulin because you can still be type diabetic, or maybe you need to control your diet, not eat as much sugar, or take some pills. Again, you caused type 2 diabetes because you made your body resistant by getting fat, or making your body resistant to insulin. And just how you cause it, you can reverse type 2 diabetes through physical exercise and all that good stuff. You can get rid of type 2 diabetes. The third one is gestational diabetes. Very simple. If a woman is pregnant and she's considered diabetic while she's pregnant, she's called gestational diabetic. One simple question might be, what is the type of diabetes that one woman can get? Gestational diabetes. Very simple. Okay, now the next thing. Okay, EKGs. Reading EKGs. Very long video. Okay, so EKGs measure everything in the body happens through electrical activity. EKGs measure the electrical activity of the heart. The heart is a muscle. It responds to electrical activity, and so it drives everything, and what causes the muscle to contract and pump out blood throughout the body. So it responds to electrical activities. EKG measures the activity through the heart. And depending on what the EKG looks like, we can tell a lot of things about the heart, electrical-wise. We can't tell structure-wise, but we can tell if the heart, you're about to have a heart attack, you're hypertensive, you have a pulmonary embolism. We can tell a lot of things by looking at the EKG, but just by looking at how the electrical activity travels through the heart, because it's supposed to go through a set pathway. It's supposed to go through a normal way called a normal sinus rhythm. That's what EKG is. Now the EKG leads that they define, you have a chest lead, limb lead, precordial lead, extreme lead, unipolar, bipolar lead. There's a lot of different names, but most of them mean the same thing. They're synonymous with the same thing. Now, EKG has 12 leads. It's a 12-lead EKG. And you get these 12 leads by placing 10 electrodes on your stomach. So you place 10 electrodes all over your body. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. 10 electrodes on your body. And this makes an EKG, which you can read on graph paper. So you have 12 leads. You have something called chest leads, limb leads, precordial, extreme leads, unipolar, bipolar. Okay, so the chest leads are called the precordial leads also. So chest lead means precordial leads. There's 6 of them. There's V1, which is like over here, V2, V3, 4, 5, 6. So like just go wrap around your chest. These are the chest leads, and also precordial leads. These are V1 to V6, which you probably know these numbers already. I'm not going to explain it all. Now you also have lead 1, 2, 3, AVF, AVL, AVR. These are called the extremity leads. The reason being is because when you actually put them on someone's body, they are formed by the extremities, by the leads on the extremities. Whereas chest leads, extremity leads. Okay, so that things what chest leads are, the extremity leads. The limb leads mean the same thing as the extremity leads. So chest leads mean the same as precordial, V1 through V6. Limb leads mean the same as extremity leads, 1, 2, 3, AVR, AVL, AVF. Now, unipolar and bipolar, this might be a question. Unipolar means that it was made with just one EKG lead. It's better just to memorize these things and knowing the concepts of how they're created, but lead 1, 2, and 3 are unipolar. Bipolar, sorry, I said that wrong. Bipolar are 1, 2, 3. Unipolar are everything but 1, 2, 3. Again, just looking at simple definitions. Okay, so now we can actually draw an EKG. 12 is be able to identify the waves, know the leads, and be able to turn the transitions on the EKGs. You have to be able to do this you have to actually be able to do this. She'll give you EKG examples of 12 leads, and she'll be like, okay, identify the, no, she won't say identify the waves, but she'll be like, what's the transition zone? What's the mean axis? What's the blah, blah, blah deviation? What's wrong with the patient? Like hypertrophic, enlarged, or whatever that. So EKG measures electrical activity. Remember, the heart is a box, 4-chamber box. First, we'll talk about the electrical activity because that'll be easier. But okay, so the heart is autorhythmic; it beats by itself. Now, it does this by something called the SA node, which is the pacemaker of the cell. The pacemaker of the cell is in your right atrium, the upper right chamber. It's in the right atrium up here. Now, the pacemaker or the SA node sends a signal every 60 to 100 beats per minute throughout the heart. So every 60 to 100 beats per minute, it's beating. So beats by itself. Every 60 to 100 beats per minute. So it's going to send the signal. It has an action potential. It's going to send the signal down the right atrium to the left atrium and the ventricles and cause them all to contract. So the signal is going to spread from the SA node. So knowing that, you can look at a lead. See if I drew it anywhere. Yep, kind of drew it. Pretty bad. Well, you already know what an EKG looks like on this one. Hopefully you've seen one. So you have P wave, QRS, and then the T wave. What the P wave represents, since the P wave, the EKG measures electrical activity of the heart. So whenever you have any bumps, that's electrical activity. So since the SA node starts in the right atrium, the P wave measures atrial contractions because obviously atriums contract before the ventricles because it starts in the SA node. So the P wave measures atrial contraction. Now, since the SA node is in the right atrium is going to contract before the left atrium. So you can divide the P wave, which is a little hump, to a right atrium, which right atrium contracts first, and then the other side is the left atrium, because which contracts second. And then you have a flat line, which is called an isoelectric line. Now, let's define, okay, so the P wave contracts, it starts in the SA node, and it has to travel to the left atrium, it has to travel to the ventricles. It travels through conduction systems. So it'll travel from the SA node to the AV node, which is down here, which is still in the right atrium, but it's a little above the intraventricular septum, which is the wall that separates the hearts from the left side, from the right side and the left side. But first, the SA node the SA node signal has to get to the left atrium because it also has to contract the left atrium. It does this through a series of connections called the Bachmann's bundle. Don't know if you know them, but it goes down to the AV node. The AV node will stop the electrical signal, the action potential for a second. The reason it stops the action potential is so blood can continue to fall from the right atrium to the right ventricle. If the action potential did not stop, blood maybe would not fall. All the blood maybe wouldn't fall to the right ventricle. So the action potential stops in order to allow the blood to fall to the right ventricle. So now, once in the AV node, then it continues down the bundle of His, which goes down the left down to the ventricles, and then it splits to the right bundle branch to the left bundle branch. Just like its name says, the right bundle branch goes to the right side of the heart, or the right ventricle. The left bundle branch goes to the left side of the heart, or the left ventricle. And then as it gets to the end, it wraps around in very, very small fibers called the Purkinje fibers, which now will contract the whole ventricles. So that's the pathway. It goes from the SA node, AV node stops a little bit, go down the bundle of His, splits in the bundle branches, go in the Purkinje fibers, and then it dies, and then it just keeps continuing. So that is the electrical pathway of the heart. So now we can look at the EKG. We have the P wave, which is the atrium contracting first. We have a flat line, which is called an isoelectric line, which means nothing's happening. This flat line is when the AV node is withholding the signal for a little bit, so the heart is not contracting. So the scientists or doctors can't measure a signal since the AV node is blocking it. But then now it's going to spread down to the ventricles, the bundle of His, and then you're going to get a QRS segment. Now the very first downward wave, if it does have downward deflection, is called the Q wave. The first upward wave is called the R wave. And then the first downward wave after the R wave is called the S wave. So Q, R, S. And then you get another wave. The QRS signifies ventricle contraction. or ventricular depolarization. Now, since the ventricles are much larger than the atrium, or they're much stronger, because if you think about it, the atrium just all the atrium do is just drop blood into the ventricles. The ventricles are responsible for pumping blood throughout the whole body or pumping blood throughout the lungs. So the ventricles are much stronger. So the ventricles are going to have a much higher voltage. They're going to measure a much higher voltage, and thus the QRS wave is much stronger, larger than the P wave. And then you're going to have a flat line and then a T wave. Now the T wave measures ventricular repolarization, or because remember after anything depolarizes, it's going to repolarize. Okay, it's anatomy, not going over that. So P wave, atrial depolarization or atrial contraction, blah blah blah, broken down two ways by atrium, left atrium, AV node. Stops momentarily, it's called PR segment. Go over again. Segments are when you have a flat line, so a PR segment. Look in the book. I don't know. Q wave first downward deflection, blah blah. R wave first upward, S wave first downward, ST segment, which is also flat. Okay, so now we will go over some things. Now this is the most tricky one. The other ones are just common sense really. That's not very helpful. But Q wave is the first downward deflection. Q wave is first down. R is the first up. S is the first down after the first up. So she can give examples of like, what if there is no Q? Well, what if it just goes like this? It goes up and then it goes down. Well, you wouldn't have a Q wave because there's no first down. It would be RS wave. Now, if it goes like R wave, down, S wave, back up, it'll be R, S, R prime. Now, those are all common sense. If you know what QRS means, you can know that. Now, what happens if it goes like this? You have P wave, PR segment, and then it goes just down, up. That's called something different than what you expected. That's called the QS segment. Q is common because it's going down first, but since it's going back up, you would think it was called a QR segment, but it's called a QS segment, and that's just something that she can trick you with, throw on you. Okay, calculate heart rate on EKG, very simple. The normal protocol to calculate heart rate is just do this. Always start at 0. You might get that can be a question. You have to start at 0. You can't start at 1, so it'll be like 0, 1, 2. Always start at 0. Count to 60. If they're exercising, obviously it doesn't make sense if someone's running or biking to do this for 60 seconds, so you do it for 15 seconds, times it by 4. Now on an EKG strip, what you do is, I don't know if she'll give it on the first test, but you have to count the boxes. There's really no way around that. I really don't feel like going over that, so just read the book. Axis deviation, mean axis, I'll go over since that's definitely you'll have to know on the test. But pretty much the electrical signal goes from the SA node to the ventricle, so it should go like this. To the ventricle, contracts at the ventricle. That's the normal thing. Now, the easiest way to know the heart, see if this shows. Damn you, light. Okay, well, I guess that's it's not too good. But know this circle. The circle is in your book, or find pictures of the circle. It's the axis deviation circle. Know this circle, memorize it, be able to draw it. But anyways, this is a circle that's superimposed on the heart. So imagine your heart rate here. Okay, so you have 0 degrees. Oh, that doesn't work. But no, you have your heart. You have your heart rate here. Superimpose a circle on it. That's what all the deviations are. You have all the angles. So the angles are found by where signals are traveling. Okay, I'm just going to go over the angles and I'm done because I don't feel like teaching this anymore. It's been too long. Or this video is going way too long. I don't really feel like teaching this anymore. It's all in the book. But the very last concept that you have to know, it's hard to learn by yourself is, okay, just knowing the angles of each lead, of all 12 leads. Well, you really don't have to know the chest leads or V1 to V6. But the angles are, you have your little circle. Okay, so now the angles are found by placing 2 electrodes on the body, a negative electrode and a positive electrode, and taking the signal from the negative electrode to the positive. It always goes from negative electrode to a positive electrode. So we will, okay, so go from negative to positive. So you have 1 electrode right here and 1 electrode right here. Left side is this, your right side and your left side. Okay, so First, we'll go over lead 1, 2, and 3. So place a negative electrode, I believe. It's been a while. No. Okay, well, 0. Okay, so sorry. Place a negative on your right. Place a positive on your left. Since it always goes from negative to positive, it'll go from negative to positive, so it'll go straight across. This will be lead 1. That's how lead 1 is found. From having a negative on the right arm, or RA equals negative, and then the left side will be positive, so it'll go like this. Now what everything I just said means, what it means is lead 1 is 0 degrees, which is why if you draw your little circle, lead 1 goes to 0 degrees. And you look in a circle, lead 1 is equivalent to 0 degrees. Lead 2 is 60 degrees, or going down like this. Okay, I'm done teaching. Clearly making everything wrong right now. Not really helping. I'm tired. But yes, that is everything on my study guide. Now, important things that you have to know in order to get the test. You can expect the multiple choice are very simple, but some examples are you have to know vapor pressure product. That would be simple. Know what happens of how all the factors change during relative exercise and absolute exercise. The reason I said on the Facebook page wasn't just because, oh, it's something to know. No, I'm saying know that because that'll be on every single test, and it's very important. Know how the body adapts with relative exercise and absolute exercise. Know how to heart rate get started on 0 when you're taking someone's heart rate. Now for case study, she'll give you a case study. It'll be a paragraph. First thing you should do with a case study is first note his age, then his family history, and then find his BMI by finding his weight and his height and calculating his BMI. Calculate all 8 risk factors and don't just say, oh, this person had, don't just say, the question is, if it says, describe how many risk factors it has, don't just say 3. You'll get the question wrong, even if you had all 3 risk factors and did have 3 risk factors. What Dr. P cares about is that you understand what the risk factors are and how to calculate them in a patient. Like if you're telling if you're talking to a physician, think about it. You're talking to a physician and the physician asks, okay, how many risk factors does this patient have? And you're just like, 4. You probably wouldn't have a job, and the physician will be like, okay, what are the risk factors? The physician doesn't really care about a number. They care about what they are. So just saying 4, that's not good enough. You have to say what the risk factors are. You can't just say a number. So you have to actually write out they have 4 risk factors because they're 48 years old, or they smoke, or blah, blah, blah. You have to write every single risk factor out. Now what I did is I went down the list with all 8 risk factors and wrote specifically. I included a lot more information than I needed to, just because it's always better to include more information than you need to, because you will never get something wrong for including too much information. So I included all the information. Let's see what else. She'll probably have a very easy page where you have to calculate rate pressure product. She'll just give you a bunch of values. Say, what is a rate pressure product? What is their cardiac output? Then you have to know what cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. Rate pressure product is heart rate times systolic blood pressure divided by 100. You have to know how to read an EKG. The 12 leads I didn't really go over because I don't feel like going over it. It'll probably be another 30 minutes. I don't feel like talking for another 30 minutes. But she'll give you a 12 lead EKG and ask you, first off, like, what is the axis deviation? Axis deviation is if they're a normal axis, right axis, extreme right axis, or left axis. Again, didn't go over it, but you have to know you have to be able to know how to calculate that. And then she'll ask you what is the mean axis. And then she'll ask you what is wrong with this person. Does this person have left ventricular hypertrophy? Does this person have right ventricular hypertrophy? Do they have left atrial enlargement, right atrial enlargement, or do they have a normal EKG? Most likely their EKG will not be normal. If she's asking what is wrong with it, there's probably something wrong with it. So my advice is know how, go on a web, the easiest way is Google, websites, internet. That's how I studied. Go on Google, type in EKG practice. There's a plethora of knowledge out there on EKGs where you can actually go through, they give you 12 EKG and say, what is wrong with this EKG? Or what is the deviation? Or what is the mean axis? And they'll walk you through it. So Google these things, type in EKG practice, there you go, there's your homework right there. Just do that over and over and over again. Or risk factors. You just have to know all 8 risk factors. Oh my god. Okay, I don't know why I'm still talking.